Good morning, everyone. Again, welcome. Again, my name is Tamar Bains. I am a native New Yorker from Queens, New York. I later joined the Army, as Ann said, in 1996 and retired in 2016 after 20 years. I thought I was going to do 6 years. Next thing I know, they're giving me a flag. Thank you for your service. After leaving the Army, I kind of pretended to be retired for about a year, and then I came back to work and started working for the National Park Service, initially here at Hamilton Grange and General Grant National Memorial, and then last year I did a season at Sequoia, Kings Canyon National Parks, which was amazing, and now I'm back home. So today we're here to talk about the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. So it's 1917. The Great War, the war to end all wars, has started in full swing in Europe, starting with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. And we have the Axis and the Allies, mostly the Germans versus the French and the British. And they're calling for help, and they need help. So in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson has asked Congress for a declaration of war to enter the conflict between the European powers because our allies are in need of service. His quote is, "The world must be safe for democracy," the president said, and the allies are to help supplement the British, the French, and the Russians. So with a call to arms and starting with a draft, we're getting a lot of Americans. This is also an opportunity, which has also come in wars, for people who normally have not had much advancement or in lower class, as an opportunity to advance themselves. So for African Americans, they see this as some see this as an opportunity to say maybe that we can now become part of the nation's narrative, because during this time frame, Jim Crow is also greatly to infect. All the gains made during Reconstruction after the Civil War have pretty much been gone to the wayside. Segregation has gone truly into effect. So they're thinking, well, maybe if we fight, they can see us as equals. But other people are like saying, I don't think so, because President Wilson also has shown a great deal of white supremacist tendencies. During his time in president, he had screened Birth of a Nation, which basically showed the Ku Klux Klan at the White House himself. He had refused to help give support to federal anti-lynching bills in the United States, because during this time frame, there is at least one lynching a week in the United States. So other black people are saying, why would we want to support someone who doesn't support us? But after a great deal of back and forth between many black leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, they decide we're going to try and go for it. So during this time frame, 2.3 million blacks entered the draft for World War I. But still, segregation was in a great deal of force, because even though so many African Americans entered the draft, a lot of the services weren't going to accept them. The United States Marine Corps would not accept any black Marines into their ranks. The Navy enlisted a few, but they were basically deckhands or cooks. Most of the African Americans that did enlist or go into the draft ended up in the Army. Of all the ones that entered their names into the draft, 375,000 blacks served overall, including 639 that would later become officers. Now, I'm going to show us a short video clip that's going to give you a little bit more detail of what it was like to serve during this time, and then I'll go back to my talk.
The Harlem Hellfighters was a regiment of New York National Guardsmen in the First World War. They were set up to fail by their own government. They were humiliated, degraded, eventually given to the French army as a throwaway, and they ended up coming home as one of the most decorated units in the entire U.S. Army.
The Harlem Hellfighters are one of the most important regiments in American history. In World War I, they helped to establish to the entire world the power of black soldiers in the military.
It was very difficult at that time for African Americans to get into the United States military, because there was this perception that African Americans would not do well in battle. They had to overcome the prejudice of their own countrymen and yet also perform ably on the battlefield.
Like so many units of African American descent, when they go overseas, they're not sure what they're going to do. Are they going to fight as infantry? Or are they going to be stevedores and load ships? Or are they going to be labor units and cut wood?
And so they're committed to labor duty, they're unloading ships, building latrines, those type of support services. And as you can imagine, these men have been trained and they're willing to fight, they're ready to fight, and this is stressful for them.
They were finally given to the French army, which in a way was an even greater insult because in the First World War, when the United States entered, General Pershing, the commanding officer, was very clear that American forces would not be fed piecemeal into the French and British army because the French and British wanted reinforcements, and Pershing said absolutely not. When Americans join this war, they will fight as an American force under an American flag led by an American general. ... except for the black guys. You can have them.
Basically, that film gives you a little bit of a clip. As they said, General Pershing, known as Blackjack to us in the Army, he was probably one of our most decorated officers in the United States Army. And he was adamant about the fact that he did not want American troops fighting under any other flag except for an American flag, except for black men. So all these black men that had enlisted we're going to go into the 369th. A lot of the soldiers that were part of the 369th were coming from northern regions, New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. But then they had to go to basic training in South Carolina. Now, during this time, the United States was not the bastion of civil rights that it was slightly a little bit better up north. Now, you've been up north most of your life. Now you're going to South Carolina. You can imagine the culture shock of dealing with Jim Crow smacked in your face, not being able to go to any restaurant, not being able to go to hotels. And it didn't matter that you were wearing a uniform of your country. So they had to deal with all these setbacks, getting ready to go to war. So basically they're at war themselves in their own country. So eventually they survive basic training because there's no other way to put it. And as you see in the video, they finally get a chance to go overseas. Well, they get overseas and they think, okay, we made it through basic training, we're soldiers, when do we get to fight? Well, as also the video stated earlier, a lot of white officers basically thought that we were not mentally competent to be soldiers. So even though they had gone through basic training, they had to go through a month's more worth of training just to be sure that they knew how to be soldiers, if you can add insult to injury. So after they've basically done another month of basic training, they said, okay, we're ready to fight. Well, none of the other units in the Army wanted these soldiers within their ranks. So General Pershing said, fine, I don't want to give my white troops to the French or the British. I'll give them a bunch of black guys to deal. And that's how we end up with the 369th. Now with the Harlem Hellfighters, as they're known, or the Black Rattlers, no one actually knows where the name came from. They don't know if it came from when they were in the States. They don't know if it came from the Germans or it came from the French, but somehow the name stuck, as it has for over 100 years. So when they end up getting assigned to these units in France, they actually start to make a name for themselves along the Western Front, which is where some of the heaviest fighting was done during the war. And they start to distinguish themselves as amazing fighters. And along the battles of Champagne, Marne, Meuse, Argonne, they have distinguished themselves many through these campaigns, and they start to get decorated, including especially for us in the Army, one of the battles that's known is Belleau Wood, which is mostly actually the Marines. The Battle of Belleau Wood, the Marines kind of have, that's their thing, but we also distinguish themselves along Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry. So it's during this time that Private Henry Johnson, who is probably one of the most famous of the soldiers in the 369th, has really distinguished themselves. During the battle, him and another soldier managed to take out a German squad with just the two of them. And during this time, he sustained 21 wounds during this incursion. And this is when true insult to injury. He distinguished himself during this skirmish that he was awarded the Croix de Guerre, the War Cross from the French, their highest military honor, with palm, which is basically our version of a valor. So if you're in the Army and you get an award during wartime and you can considerably distinguish yourself, you'll get a V device with valor. So it's their equivalent of the War Cross with the palm, which is a valor device. But when he gets back to his unit in the States, he doesn't even get a Purple Heart. They don't even cite it in his record. So when he eventually leaves the service, and then when he gets back to the States, they said he eventually ends up with the Distinguished Service Cross, but then they make him take it off. You don't deserve to wear that because you're basically black. So they don't put that in his records. So he eventually leaves the service with no record of all the ways he distinguished himself in the Army. So he eventually, unfortunately, passes away in 1929, mostly due in poverty and due to the injuries he sustained during the World War I. But somehow his story stays alive, and for many, many years, he's advocated on. So eventually in 1996, President Clinton awards him the Purple Heart at the bare minimum. Then eventually, after more records, he's posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award. But that's still not enough. Eventually, in 2015, what's right is done, and he's awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama. So I'm going to show you a little bit of why Sergeant Johnson was awarded the Purple Heart.
As a young man, Henry Johnson joined millions of other African Americans on the great migration from the rural South to the industrial North, a people in search of a better life. He landed in Albany, where he mixed sodas at a pharmacy, worked in a coal yard, and as a porter at a train station. And when the United States entered World War I, Henry enlisted. He joined one of only a few units that he could, the all-black 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. And soon he was headed overseas. At the time, our military was segregated. Most black soldiers served in labor battalions, not combat units. But General Pershing sent the 369th to fight with the French Army, which accepted them as their own. Quickly, the Hellfighters lived up to their name, and in the early hours of May 15th, 1918, Henry Johnson became a legend. His battalion was in northern France, tucked into a trench. Some slept, but he couldn't. Henry and another soldier, Needham Roberts, stood sentry along no man's land. In the pre-dawn, it was pitch black and silent, and then a click, the sound of wire cutters. A German raiding party, at least a dozen soldiers, maybe more, fired a hail of bullets. Henry fired back until his rifle was empty. Then he and Needham threw grenades. Both of them were hit. Needham lost consciousness. Two enemy soldiers began to carry him away while another provided cover, firing at Henry. But Henry refused to let them take his brother in arms. He shoved another magazine into his rifle. It jammed. He turned the gun around and swung it at one of the enemy, knocking him down. Then he grabbed the only weapon he had left, his bolo knife, and went to rescue Needham. Henry took down one enemy soldier, then the other. The soldier he knocked down with his rifle recovered, and Henry was wounded again. But armed with just his knife, Henry took him down too. And finally, reinforcements arrived, and the last enemy soldier fled. As the sun rose, the scale of what happened became clear. In just a few minutes of fighting, 2 Americans defeated an entire raiding party, and Henry Johnson saved his fellow soldier from being taken prisoner. Henry became one of our most famous soldiers of the war. His picture was printed on recruitment posters and ads for victory war stamps. Former President Teddy Roosevelt wrote that he was one of the bravest men in the war. In 1919, Henry rode triumphantly in a victory parade. The crowds lined Fifth Avenue for miles cheering this American soldier. Henry was one of the first Americans to receive France's highest award for valor. But his own nation didn't award him anything, not even the Purple Heart, though he had been wounded 21 times. Nothing for his bravery, though he had saved a fellow soldier at great risk to himself. His injuries left him crippled. He couldn't find work. His marriage fell apart, and in his early 30s, he passed away. Now, America can't change what happened to Henry Johnson. We can't change what happened to too many soldiers like him who went uncelebrated because our nation judged them by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. But we can do our best to make it right.
So eventually, after many, many years, as President Obama said, we can try to make wrongs right. So I want to read the very last part of the citation for his Medal of Honor. And as a soldier, these were, as someone who's also received a fairly high award, the last words are very, very meaningful to us. Because if you choose to wear the uniform and you choose to serve honorably, hearing those words means that our service is valued. Displaying great courage, Private Johnson held back the enemy force until they retreated. Private Johnson's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. So, as President Obama stated, we can't change the past, but we can learn from it and we can try to make things right. So going back, again, after all these great deeds on the battlefield in France and showing that they have the greatest courage to come back to the United States where it was not what you're expecting. It was very common at certain functions and lecture tours that you could wear your uniform, but they would actually be arrested for doing that if they were black, while their white counterparts could do that. And it's just, again, they would use their images in recruiting materials to show bravery, but back home they were basically treated again as second-class citizens. So basically the only just due they got was when they came back after the end of World War I, and they got to march on a massive parade on Fifth Avenue. That's basically the last of the gratitude they were given, where they had to go back to just being treated as boy or as second-class citizens, or ended up destitute because you could not find any work after you have done your country service. So this, we have an image of now Sergeant Johnson. He was posthumously promoted to sergeant when he was given his Croix de Guerre, and you can see the pride that he has for being given credit for what he's done on the battlefield. But unfortunately, when he got back to the States, Private Johnson, he actually was braver than most, because he came back to do a lecture talk, and he basically said his truth, and his truth was that he was treated poorly, that there was a great deal of racism, sometimes even cowardice amongst the white troops, and he was actually arrested under the espionage. He was actually arrested, and then after that he was no longer given invitations to talk, and that's when he eventually died in poverty. But still, during the war, again, his image was used in recruiting campaigns, but his image was all that they wanted and not the man himself. But eventually he was given his just due. This is the Sergeant Major of the United States National Guard who accepted the award on his behalf, because unfortunately Sergeant Johnson had no living family members at the time. And at the Pentagon, there's called the Hall of Heroes. For every airman, soldier, sailor, Marine who's given the Medal of Honor, your name is basically emblazoned. And this is the day that Sergeant Johnson's name was entered into the Hall of Heroes, where he belongs. And Sergeant Johnson is currently at rest in Arlington National Cemetery, and his marker is shown that he has received the highest honor he, at the very minimum, deserved. So now we have past and the present. We have the 369th Infantry Brigade again walking on Fifth Avenue after the end of World War I, and we now have the 369th Sustainment Brigade, which still lives on in the New York National Guard. They're basically stationed in New York City. As you can see, it's a little bit more diverse, men, women of all colors and persuasions, because they represent the city that they're from, which is New York City. The last thing I want to show is, after all that, eventually in 1948, under Executive Order 9981, which ended segregation in the United States military under President Eisenhower, just shows where we've come. We still can go a long way, but eventually we can right the wrongs of the past.